She walked onto one of the most secure military bases in America wearing a gray t-shirt, jeans, and worn-out sneakers. No uniform. No rank. No introduction. And within the hour, 4 of the most powerful generals in the United States military were standing at full attention, saluting her. The Navy SEAL who laughed at her could not speak. The room went completely silent. And nobody in that command center would ever forget what happened next. This is the story they buried for decades. And today, it finally comes to light. If you love your mom or your dad, and you believe real heroes deserve to be seen, hit that subscribe button right now. This one is for every quiet warrior who never asked for credit. Her name was Merrill. And if you pass her on the street in Charleston, South Carolina, you would never give her a second glance. She was 58 years old, with light brown hair that had begun to silver at the temples, calm blue eyes that rarely blinked too fast, and hands that were always steady, steadier than most surgeons, steadier than most soldiers. She drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper. She attended Sunday service at a small Baptist church 3 blocks from her house. She kept a vegetable garden in her backyard and made the best peach preserves her neighbors had ever tasted. She was, by every visible measure, the most unremarkable woman in the neighborhood. That was exactly the point. Merrill had spent the better part of 3 decades making sure no one looked at her twice. She had perfected the art of invisibility not as a personal choice but as a professional necessity. Because the woman who tended that vegetable garden and smiled at her neighbors over the fence had also, at various points in her life, operated in the shadows of 4 different continents, spoken 8 languages fluently, dismantled 2 foreign intelligence networks from the inside, and made decisions that had quietly changed the outcome of events that the American public would never fully understand. She had never once been photographed in uniform. Her name appeared in no public record, no database that any civilian could access, and no memorial that any tourist could visit. She had served her country in a way that required her to disappear from it, completely, permanently, and without complaint. She had agreed to all of it. Every single term. And for 29 years, she had kept her silence so completely that even her closest friends had no idea who she truly was. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Catherine received a phone call from an old colleague, a man she had worked alongside in a classified operation nearly 2 decades earlier, someone she trusted with the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from having your life depend on another person's judgment in the field. His name was Colonel James Whitfield, and he was now attached to the Joint Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He told her there was a ceremony being held that afternoon to honor a group of decorated veterans, and that her late husband's name, Major Richard Merrill, would be among those posthumously recognized. He asked if she would come. He said it would mean a great deal to the men who had served alongside Richard. He said it quietly, the way men like James Whitfield say things they mean deeply. Catherine said yes. She drove 4 hours alone. She wore no special clothing, made no special preparations. She arrived at the gate of Fort Bragg at noon in her cracked bumper Honda Civic, handed her civilian identification to the gate officer, and was directed toward the main ceremony grounds as a civilian guest. She was given a visitor's lanyard. She was escorted to a waiting area near the entrance of the command building where other guests were gathering before the ceremony began. She stood near the back, holding a small photograph of Richard, and she waited quietly the way she had always waited, without fidgeting, without checking her phone, without needing anything from anyone around her. That was when Petty Officer First Class Dominic Reyes noticed her. Dominic Reyes was 29 years old, a Navy SEAL with 3 combat deployments behind him and the kind of confidence that comes from being genuinely exceptional at a very dangerous job. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the specific ease of a man who had never yet encountered a situation he couldn't physically dominate. He was stationed at Fort Bragg on a temporary joint assignment and was helping coordinate security for the afternoon's ceremony. He was good at his job. He was also, on this particular afternoon, in the kind of mood that makes good men do careless things, slightly bored, slightly impatient, and surrounded by fellow operators who were watching him with the casual competitive energy that never fully leaves a group of elite soldiers even when they are standing still. He spotted Catherine near the restricted access corridor that led to the interior of the command building. She was standing 3 feet closer to that corridor than a civilian guest should have been standing. He walked over with the measured stride of someone exercising authority they are fully entitled to exercise. He looked her over once, the grey t-shirt, the jeans, the visitor's lanyard, the total absence of anything military about her appearance, and he asked, loud enough for the man near him to hear, what her rank was. His tone carried the unmistakable edge of a joke. The implication was clear. She had no rank. She was a civilian at a military base who had wandered slightly out of bounds, and he was the professional who was going to redirect her. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not change. Her eyes did not harden or soften. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already completely assessed and filed away. Then she reached into her old leather bag, removed a small identification card, and handed it to him without a word. Dominic Reyes looked at the card. The color left his face. He read it again. Then he looked up at her. Then he looked back at the card. His jaw did not drop. He was too trained for that, but something behind his eyes shifted in the way that only happens when a person realizes they have made a serious miscalculation. He excused himself quietly, stepped 6 feet away, and made a radio call. His voice was low and controlled. The man who had been watching him with casual amusement stopped smiling. Something in his posture had changed. He made a second call. Then a third. 4 minutes passed. Then the doors at the far end of the corridor opened. Brigadier General Ellen Foster came through first, walking at a pace that was just short of urgent. Behind him came Major General Sandra Klein, the only woman in the group, her uniform pressed to a standard that made everyone else in the room look slightly wrinkled by comparison. Behind her came Lieutenant General Marcus Webb, a man with 40 years of service and a reputation throughout the entire special operations community as someone who did not move quickly for anyone. And behind him came General Raymond Holt, 4 stars, Commander of United States Army Forces Command, a man who had not personally walked a corridor at this pace in years. They came through that door and they crossed the room and they stopped in front of Catherine Merrill. And every single one of them saluted her. Not a courtesy salute. Not the kind of salute exchanged between officers of similar rank as a professional formality. The kind of salute you give when you are standing in front of someone who has earned something you understand completely and respect without reservation. General Holt held his salute for 4 full seconds. In military terms, that is an eternity. The room was absolutely silent. Dominic Reyes stood 3 feet away with the identification card still in his hand, and he did not move, because there was nothing in his training, his experience, or his understanding of the world that had prepared him for this moment. Catherine Merrill returned each salute with the calm precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Then she shook General Holt's hand, and the two of them exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation that no one else in the room was cleared to hear. What Dominic Reyes had seen on that identification card, what had sent him to his radio and brought 4 generals across a building in under 5 minutes, was a classification level and an authorization code that most people inside the United States military never see in their entire careers. It was the kind of credential that exists in a category so restricted that even the act of explaining what category it belongs to requires a clearance that fewer than 200 people in the country currently hold. What it told General Holt and the others, when Reyes relayed what he had read, was not simply who Catherine Merrill was. It told them what she had done. And what she had done was something that each of those 4 generals knew about, not because they had been there, but because they had been briefed, years later, on the outcome of a mission that had prevented a catastrophe of a scale that would have fundamentally altered the United States' position in the world. They knew the operation by its code name. They had never known the name of the person responsible for its success. Until now. The story of what Catherine Merrill had actually done begins 27 years earlier, in the spring of a year that most Americans now associate with other events entirely. She was 31 years old, freshly recruited into a division of the Defense Intelligence Agency that did not appear on any organizational chart. She had been identified during her graduate studies at Georgetown, not for her academic record, though that was exceptional, but for a specific combination of qualities that a particular recruiter had been authorized to seek out. She possessed near-perfect recall, an extraordinary capacity for reading behavioral patterns in real time, fluency in languages that very few Americans spoke, and a temperament that psychological evaluation after psychological evaluation described in nearly identical terms: unshakable under pressure, invisible in plain sight, and completely without ego. That last quality, the evaluators noted, was the rarest of all. She was trained for 18 months in a facility she was never told the location of. She was taught things that changed the way she understood the world permanently. And then she was placed, quietly, without ceremony, without a rank that any standard military database would recognize, into the field. Her first operation lasted 11 months. She assumed an identity so completely that she sometimes had to remind herself, in the quiet moments before sleep, of her own name. She gathered intelligence that led to the dismantling of a procurement network that had been funneling weapons-grade material to people who intended to use it. She did this alone. She did this without backup she could call on openly, without any official acknowledgement that she existed in that country doing that work. When it was over, she walked out the same way she had walked in, quietly, without leaving a trace, without anyone knowing what had happened or who had made it happen. She went home. She rested for 3 weeks. She was debriefed. And then she went back out. Over the following 2 decades, she ran operations that the American public will likely never know about in any detail. Not because the government is hiding heroism for political reasons, but because the nature of what she did requires a permanent silence to remain effective. The methods she used, the networks she built, the identities she inhabited, all of it remains classified not as a bureaucratic formality but as an active operational necessity. There are people still in the field today whose safety depends on the details of Catherine Merrill's work remaining exactly where they are, locked inside a system that does not speak. What General Holt and the others knew was the summary. The outcome. The fact that on 3 separate occasions, missions that Catherine Merrill ran had produced intelligence that allowed the United States to act in ways that prevented losses, of life, of security, of strategic position, that would have been devastating. One of those occasions involved a domestic threat. The kind that, had it succeeded, would have been the kind of news event that people describe in terms of where they were when they heard about it. She had stopped it. Alone. Using nothing but her mind, her training, and a set of skills she had spent years developing in silence. She had never told anyone. Not her neighbors. Not her pastor. Not the women she sat with at church on Sunday mornings. Not even her children fully understood what their mother had done with her life. They knew she had worked for the government. They knew it had been important. They had been raised to understand that asking further questions was something their mother could not answer, and they had accepted that the way children of such parents learn to accept it, with a mixture of pride and a quiet ache for the parts of their parent they were never allowed to know. Richard, her husband, had known. Richard had been one of the few people in her life who understood completely, because he had lived inside that same world. He had been Special Forces, and when he died 6 years earlier, not in the field, but from the kind of cancer that accumulates quietly in a body that has been pushed through extraordinary stress for extraordinary periods of time, he had died knowing exactly who his wife was. He had told her once, near the end, that he was prouder of her than of anything he had ever done himself. She had held his hand and told him that was ridiculous. He had laughed. It was one of the last times he laughed, and she kept the sound of it somewhere inside her that no operation, no mission, no amount of professional distance had ever been able to reach. It was for Richard that she had driven 4 hours to Fort Bragg that afternoon. Not for recognition. Not for any ceremony that involved her own name. Simply to be present when his name was spoken aloud in a room full of people who understood what it meant to serve the way Richard had served. She had not expected anything to happen. After the salutes, after the handshakes, after General Holt spoke quietly with her for several minutes in a tone that Dominic Reyes, standing nearby, described afterward as the most respectful conversation he had ever witnessed between any two human beings in any setting, after all of that, the ceremony proceeded. Richard Merrill's name was read aloud. His service record, carefully edited to remove the classified elements but still remarkable in its visible form, was acknowledged. Catherine sat in the front row. General Holt had personally directed that she be given that seat. She held her photograph of Richard in her lap and she did not cry. Not because she was not moved, but because she had long ago learned to hold the things that moved her most deeply in a place that did not require expression to be real. Dominic Reyes approached her afterward. He stood in front of her with the posture of a man who has been genuinely humbled, which is a different posture entirely from the posture of a man who is simply embarrassed. He apologized. He did not make excuses. He did not explain the circumstances that had led to his comment or attempt to contextualize his tone. He simply said he was sorry, that he had been disrespectful, and that it would not happen again. Catherine looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that he would repeat, in various contexts, for the rest of his career. She said, "Son, the people who have given the most to this country are almost never the ones you can see. Remember that every time you look at someone and think you already know what they are." She patted his arm once. Then she picked up her bag, thanked General Holt for his time, and walked back toward the parking lot where her 2009 Honda Civic was waiting with its cracked rear bumper and 214,000 miles on the odometer. She drove home alone. She stopped once, at a gas station outside of Rockingham, and bought a bottle of water and a packet of peanut butter crackers. She ate them in the car with the window down, listening to the particular silence of the Carolina countryside in the late afternoon, and she thought about Richard, and she thought about the years, and she thought about all the things that had never been said and never would be said and were somehow, in their silence, more present than anything that had ever been spoken. She got home just after 8 in the evening. She fed her cat. She watered her garden in the last of the daylight. She made a cup of tea, sat in the chair by the window that had always been her favorite chair, and she read until she fell asleep with the book open in her lap. In the weeks that followed, something quiet and unstoppable began to happen. Dominic Reyes, who had returned to his unit, found that he could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He had told no one the details, the identification card, the classification, the specifics of what he had read, because he understood that those details were not his to share. But he had told the story in its outlines, carefully, to people he trusted. And those people had told people they trusted. And the story, stripped of its classified elements but intact in its essential truth, had begun to move through the special operations community the way certain stories move, not loudly, not publicly, but with the quiet persistence of something that people need to know. Within 3 months, Catherine Merrill had received 17 handwritten letters from active duty service members she had never met. Some of them were brief, a sentence or two, a name, a unit. Some of them were long and careful and full of the kind of honesty that people reserve for letters they know may never be acknowledged. All of them said, in their different ways, the same thing. Thank you. We see you. It matters. She kept every letter in a box in her bedroom closet. She did not respond to any of them. Not because she was indifferent, the opposite was true. But because she understood that her response, in the language she had always spoken most fluently, was the work itself. The years. The silence. The choices made in rooms that no one would ever see, for outcomes that no one would ever fully understand. That was her response. It always had been. There is a version of heroism that the world knows how to celebrate. It has a uniform and a ceremony and a medal that catches the light. It has a photograph and a headline and a moment when the crowd rises to its feet. That version of heroism is real, and it deserves every celebration it receives. But there is another version. It wears a grey t-shirt and drives a car with a cracked bumper and tends a vegetable garden and makes peach preserves for its neighbors and sits in the back of a church on Sunday mornings without anyone knowing what it carries. It does not ask to be seen. It does not need the crowd to rise. It has already done what it came to do, and it has gone back home, and it is sitting in its favorite chair by the window with a book open in its lap. Catherine Merrill was that version. She was the version that does not get the headline, does not get the monument, does not get the moment when the world stops and says, "Look at what this person gave." She got 4 generals and a room full of silence. And if you understood what that silence contained, you would know it was more than enough. The Navy SEAL who asked her rank as a joke went on to become one of the most thoughtful officers in his unit. People who served with him in the years after Fort Bragg noted that something had changed in him, a quality of attention, a habit of looking at people more carefully before assuming he understood them. He never spoke publicly about what had changed. But in private, when asked, he always said the same thing. He said he had met someone who taught him that the most important things are almost always the ones you cannot see. He never forgot her name. None of them did. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who gave quietly and asked for nothing in return, a parent, a grandparent, someone who cared more than you ever knew, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. Every hero deserves to be remembered. Every sacrifice deserves a witness. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? What city, what state, what corner of this great country are you in right now? Let us know. This story belongs to all of you.